Hello, I'm Sara Lloyd and I'm here with Madhumita Murgia, and we're here to speak about her book Code Dependent. So welcome, Madhu. It's lovely to be speaking to you. This is our exclusive interview to go with your book, Code Dependent. We're going to start with a question just about, your background. If you could tell me a little bit about how you got into the field of AI journalism.
So I trained as a scientist. I was a biologist and later an immunologist, and I kind of thought that's what I would do. But I'd always wanted to write, and I felt like I needed to take the plunge or I'd be stuck in a lab forever, which I didn't want to be. So I kind of moved over to journalism, but I wanted to kind of bring with me my interest and fascination with science and complexity. And I wanted to kind of use my skills as a communicator to explain these complex topics that I thought were really important for people to understand in a way that was kind of for a lay audience. And so I started to write about science, about health, and adjacently about technology. And that's, my early years of writing about technology was also when the tech industry was expanding. So this was 2012, just over a decade ago. And many of the apps and services we use today and we take for granted, like Uber or Airbnb, Instagram, and so on, they were tiny startups that I was writing about at the time. So I, as a journalist, kind of grew up along with the tech industry. And so I came across AI really early on in my career, and I was writing about things like brain-machine interfaces, which is kind of an implant in the brain that can get you to move a robotic arm and things like that back in 2013. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was kind of a perfect culmination of my interest in science and health, but also in technology. And I also thought it kind of made it really human. I like that AI isn't just about the technology. It's about how we use it and how we apply it. And it's really close to human intelligence. So that was why I kind of got fascinated with it. And I stuck with it and have been writing about it for the last just over a decade.
So fascinating how you got into it. And it's really clear from reading the book that it's the human stories, as you're sort of saying, that are the thing that really draws you in. And was there one particular story that you started with that made you think this could be a book?
Yeah, there was actually. I was writing for almost a year about facial recognition. So this was in 2018 or so. And I was just really fascinated by firstly, how the technology had advanced so quickly to become so accurate, but also how it was being used so widely by kind of governments, companies all around the world. And I met the owner of Gordon's Wine Bar, which is this bar in the Embankment in London. And he told me this fascinating story about how they had lots of pickpockets at their bar. So he'd developed his own facial recognition company, which was trained on these sort of repeat offenders. And then he'd installed it in his bar to kind of catch these pickpockets, because a lot of his own friends who would come to the bar were really annoyed that, their wallets had been taken or whatever. So that kind of got me into this whole facial recognition world. And I met Carl Rissenek, who's in my book. And he's African-American. He's a researcher who was instrumental in the early development of the technology, and he's been doing it for decades. And he kind of expressed to me how he felt so conflicted about the fact that he'd played a role in developing a technology that he thought was going to do, a world of good. He developed it because he thought it was going to be able to find missing children. In fact, his facial recognition technology was used to capture Whitey Bulger, who was a notorious criminal in the US. And he'd basically used AI to age a picture of Whitey Bulger because nobody had seen him for like decades. He'd been in hiding in California. And his AI system aged the photo so that police would know what he looked like in the present, and they caught him on camera. So, for him, that was why he'd kind of invented this technology. But here we were today where it's being used, at protests and to police entire neighborhoods, to kind of watch and surveil people. And he, as a black man, felt that he somehow had created this monster that sort of he couldn't stop anymore. And I was just really fascinated by the moral dilemma of a person who had, created a technology and kind of now it had gone out of their control. So that set me off on this thinking of could I find other people like this who have nuanced relationships with AI? Because it's not black and white. It's not good or bad. It's both. And, there are so many of these, gray areas and spaces where the stories can be told. And I felt like the only way to do that was to go and find ordinary individuals with these stories and be able to kind of draw out these ideas rather than just go to the inventors of the technology. So that was kind of my quest. And then I had to go find 8 or 9 people. And that was where this book came from.
And how did you go about finding the 8 or 9 stories? What was the beginning of that journey for you?
So yeah, this is actually the question I get asked the most, which I guess is the most interesting part of the book is, how did you know that this had happened to these people? So Carl was the first person and I built one story around him. But then the thing that I wanted this book to be is a very global book because I had seen examples of AI technology in lots of different parts of the world outside of just the US or the UK. And I felt like people didn't realize that this was actually so global and that it's very different in any different context. In an Indian context or in Latin America, it's very different to how we use it in the UK or America. So I first was looking at different regions and I was looking for examples of companies or technologies and how they'd been applied. And then I would kind of go looking for a person. So in India, I was looking around at how it was being used and I came across this healthcare company, Cure AI, whose AI technologies are used to diagnose diseases from scans. So it could be X-rays or CT scans. And they were using it for things like tuberculosis, lung cancer, COVID later on. And so I basically thought, let me try and find where it's being used and find a person who's been kind of involved with that. And that's how I found Ashita Singh, who's a doctor who'd been kind of using these technologies in a really rural part of the country, really unexpected place where you'd never expect AI to play a role. And I was really kind of curious how she thought it changed the experience of being a doctor. So that's how I would go and kind of find examples and then try and find a person who'd kind of been using this and kind of their story with the technology.
And I love the way in the book that you really bring the stories out of people and you shade those shades of grey and that nuance, as you say. And do you think in terms of all of those stories and the work you've done on the book, do you come out with a strong sense of maybe what the opportunities of AI and the sort of threats or challenges of AI? Would you be able to sort of say a little bit about what you think both of those might be?
Yeah. So I think the steady march of technology means that, there's going to be progress. And that's what humans live for. We invented this technology as we did so many others. And so it's impossible to turn back the clock on something or even to say that this is all bad because this is going to move us forward as a society and as an economy. So yes, there are so many opportunities. I think for me personally, healthcare, science, and education are the main ones. I've talked about healthcare a little bit in terms of being able to diagnose diseases better than some of the best doctors out there, maybe better than any human doctor today. Some algorithms are better. And if we even look at our NHS here, we're just struggling with how overwhelmed the system is. There's a huge shortage of radiologists. We can't see specialists for months at a time. So you can only just imagine how a technology like this could bridge the gap so that your child would be getting the best treatment an early diagnosis from one of the best doctors today rather than waiting for 5 months until things got a lot worse. So you can see how this can really be life-changing. And similarly with science, which again is, for me, it's personal because I used to study it. It's amazing to see the progress that's been made with how science is done using AI. And I think that's one of the most kind of undertold stories of this whole thing. DeepMind, which is owned by Google, but really was founded and is based here in London in King's Cross. Some of the most amazing work that they've done has shown how scientists are now using their technology to kind of they have AlphaFold, for example, as one of their AI systems, which can predict the structure of every known protein in the universe. And if you think about the change, like previously it would take one PhD student, an entire PhD, to come up with the structure of one protein. So 4 years for one person to come up with one protein structure.
Yeah.
And now they can just predict them all, billions of them. And that means we can invent new things at a scale of like months rather than decades. And just think about how that could change sort of energy use, medicine and, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, so many areas. It just kind of speeds up the invention process and innovation, by decades. So I think that's super exciting. And education is one that lots of people are excited about, but I think the jury's still out. But, it could be amazing as a way to kind of tutor at an individual tailored level, each child at their level to their interests, but not just children, adults too. If you think about how we learn as adults, mostly it's through reading, through books or journalism or whatever, that's how we educate ourselves. But imagine if you had something you could just talk to anytime you wanted and just say, I have a silly question about this. And then you just have like a little mini session kind of learning about it. It just would change so much how we learned, but also the speed and the scale of what we could learn.
That's amazing. And I think in the book you talk quite a lot about, in a way, there's a sort of message in the book partly around accessibility and making sure if we're going to use these tools for these fantastic purposes that you're outlining, let's make sure that we do that so that underrepresented communities and people who might not always have access to things do have access. And that's kind of one of your messages I felt when I was reading the book.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the whole point of, I guess, any new technology and AI in particular is to be able to sort of get access to a form of cheap intelligence, really. It's to be able to access things that otherwise you would have to pay a lot of money or be in a very privileged position to be able to get that decision or that output. So kind of the whole point of it is to improve our society and kind of fix some of these really complex issues, whether that's lack of education or healthcare and, these kinds of intractable problems. And I think the danger is, because of how power is being concentrated, where there are just a few companies, they're mostly American, who control the technology. And, ultimately they're profit-driven companies. They want to make money from it. That you'll end up having it, in the same places where we already have access to this stuff. And yes, it might make our lives easier and more productive and more kind of economic growth for all, which maybe can get reinvested and spread out around the world. But I think it's so important that, a lot of the stories in my book look at what happens when things go wrong. And it's not just because AI is dangerous. In some cases, yes, it can be designed to have bias, and that can kind of be automated and scaled up in a way that human bias isn't, right? But it's not always the technology itself. It's how we apply it, or the fact that when errors are made, as they will be, there's nobody there sort of auditing it or kind of checking that it's gone wrong. So a lot of the work that we have cut out for us as these things get implemented is, making sure that it's done in a way that benefits the people who really need it, and that when it does go wrong and sort of mistakes, errors, biases get multiplied, that we're there to catch it, to put that right, to redesign it, and that we're cognizant of it. And that we don't get to a point of reliance on these machines where we just sort of defer to them, and that we lose the things that, make us human and superior to machines, which is our own lived experiences and the expertise we gain from that, empathy, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to communicate. These are all things that AI can't do. And so I hope that we preserve what's best about us alongside these systems, so that we don't get into situations where, we're putting a target on the back of a black teenager, which is one of the stories in my book, which police are doing in Amsterdam, for example. So, there are ways to work around it, and I think ways to prevent it happening. But we have to be really kind of aware and have agency in the process.
Agency is such a good word, actually. And I was wondering, what advice do you have for people who are listening to your book or reading your book, in terms of what we can do as individuals to kind of retain agency or make smarter, kind of more mindful choices when we're kind of encountering AI, which we're going to start doing more and more in just our day-to-day lives. Do you have any advice, having written the book and met all these people and kind of drawn together your conclusions? What would you say to people?
Yeah, I think often people feel like in the face of these big, nameless corporations, not nameless, faceless corporations, what could we do against a $1 trillion company or multi-billion-dollar company? It's going to happen anyway. But that's not how we operate, as humans and as a society. That's what drives us, a sense of purpose, and the fact that we have agency and we can change things around us. And I think what I found in my book was, yes, AI does impinge on our individual agency. And so it's difficult to fight back when you have a system telling you, actually, you're not going to get your benefits this month because we think there's fraud, and then it's just suspended for a month, and you can't change that. So on that level, it's really difficult. But I think the only way for us to kind of make sure that we have a voice in this is to question as we use these systems actively, whether it's ChatGPT at work or using kind of images to create, AI photographs or whatever that may be, to kind of always be willing to speak up for ourselves, to say, we're not being compensated properly, or whether that's via a union, that's happening with voice actors. Their union is kind of speaking up and saying, you have to write this into the contract. You can't use the voices of voice actors in AI systems without permission. So people are starting to realize and then finding ways to fight for our rights, just as we have for centuries with every other revolution, industrial revolution, and so on. And the one thing that I discovered through the writing of this book, which I thought was really fascinating, was that our sense of collective agency has actually been strengthened.
True.
In the face of these systems. So for me, the best example was gig workers. This was an industry that didn't even really exist before Uber, at least on the scale and on the global scale that it does today. Now you have food delivery, medicine delivery, so many different types of gig work that you can buy in sort of every country around the world. I visited people and spoke to gig workers in Argentina, in Nairobi, in India, in the UK, in Romania, in Indonesia. Like everywhere you have these apps that you can just order people to bring you things on, right? And we don't think about how that's transformed in just such a short span of time. And so much of their work is kind of controlled by algorithms. But it's been so fascinating to see how they've banded together, come together to share tips and tricks of like, how do we get around the algorithm? How do we maximize our pay? And also to fight back, just recently at Valentine's Day in the UK, Deliveroo and Uber Eats workers went on strike because it's one of the busiest evenings of the year. They're willing to stand up and say, we're not just going to agree to what an algorithm hands down. We want more transparency. We want to know why we're being paid. And that's kind of one of the focus of one of the chapters in the book as well. So I think we should, the way to do it is not to forget that we still have the same voices and the same avenues to kind of fight for what we want, even though the technology is going to be very clever and very ubiquitous. And I have these 10 questions which get people to think about the sort of ordinary human issues that come with these AI systems, and to not be sort of scared off by the fact that it's a really complicated technology.
Yeah, and what you're saying is making me think about ultimately the value of human connection, that we can also use the technology, and those gig workers that you're talking about, they're using the technology to connect in large scale ways to then make their voices heard. So it's not all about, the technology taking agency away from us all the time. Yeah,
no, I think that the way that generative AI has kind of grown over the last year, of course, the easy thing is to look at it and say it's going to take all our jobs if you're a writer or a photographer or a voice artist or whatever. But it's also like it's also an avenue to really change how we do things. It might kind of transform creativity in a way that we could have never predicted. recently spoke to a Wharton business professor, and he's got a book coming out, and he was saying, "Oh, I wouldn't have been able to write this book without ChatGPT or GPT-4." And at first I thought, well, is that cheating? Like I didn't use any AI systems to write my book. But then you think about how it can bring people who have something to say, who have really valuable voice to share with the world, but may not be able to write. And that, does that mean they should never be able to write a book? Like maybe we still want to hear what they have to say.
They have to say, yeah.
And maybe this is a way to draw in new voices and new artists or whatever into being able to create in a way that we couldn't before. So I think there's going to be lots of unanticipated consequences of this. But yeah, so as long as we don't walk into it, just sort of accepting that we can't, that this is terrible and we can't change anything.
It's wonderful to hear these kind of notes of optimism as well. I think that's something you bring to light in your book as well, that there's lots to play for, and that we have the power, we have the agency to make that happen. So having written your book, do you ultimately feel sort of more optimistic or more concerned, would you say, if you had to choose?
It's a really tough question. And I think it's something I think about all the time because, also in my job as a journalist at the FT, I write about AI every day. And so I think, overall, I feel excited because I am a techno-optimist at heart and a scientist. And I think I feel excited about how we've managed to create something that is, so powerful and unique that humans have managed to do this. It's a sense of sort of wonder and triumph, and that it can have these amazing applications that could really change society. So I think that part of me just feels like positive and optimistic about it. But I do think that through the reporting and writing of my book, I realized how, even with the best of intentions, things can go wrong. And you can have all these unintended consequences from when a really powerful technology gets implemented into society. And what's really unique about AI and this wave we're seeing now is that it's so fast. Previously you had a technology developed, say, by the military or by scientists, and then it would take sort of decades before it was consumer friendly and came out into the world and people really understood how it worked. We don't have that today. People like OpenAI are literally putting out things that they've just invented, like a few months ago. Of course, they're doing it kind of making sure it's safe, but nobody really understands how these systems work. Are they going to get exponentially more powerful over time, or are they just going to plateau out? Nobody. And how they actually work, why they're so good at what they do, we don't quite know either. We kind of have an idea of sort of where the patterns are coming from, but we couldn't back solve an equation in there. So I think that speed, that opacity, and that sort of rapid diffusion into a society that's like really had no time to get our heads around it, that worries me. And not because there's going to be like, some existential Frankenstein style monster or anything like that. But I think that I worry that we're all going to float on this kind of cloud of saying, this is an amazing technology, let's do more and more of it. And we start to lose
perspective.
The perspective of where humans can still play a role. And do we really need AI everywhere? Do we want to be listening to audiobooks written and narrated by AI, or is there something valuable about keeping humans here? So I worry as businesses, companies and people start to just sort of roll this out and experiment with it, we lose some of the most valuable things about our society, whether that's our creatives. Are they being compensated? Will we still have photographers in 5 years if you can just generate a photograph, and what will that mean for us if those types of people no longer exist? And the other thing about the future of work, right? If these systems are as intelligent as we think they are, and they're able to do tasks and jobs and, and make our lives easier, great. But then, what do we do? Even if it's an economically bountiful life, what's our purpose? It's not so much I'm going to lose my job. I think that there'll be new jobs or there'll be enough sort of value created out of this that's not going to be a primary concern. It's more this sort of very like kind of existential question of like, okay, so what is our purpose as individuals? What will we go on to do? How will life change?
How will we find meaning almost?
Yeah. And that's something that I do think about a lot, kind of how human relationships will change and memory and these kinds of questions. So yeah, I would say optimistic for some of the ways in which it's going to kind of help, which we've talked about. Worried about who's going to suffer and who's going to be harmed in the course of this really rapid rollout. And sort of pensive and thoughtful about what our society looks like, even in 10 years, what is the world look like when my children are adults?
And it seems to me that will be somewhat dependent on who's making the decisions, right? And do those people have the wisdom, and are they listening to, the needs and the rights of different people in society and all of that?
Yeah.
So we're going to need great leaders, aren't we?
Well, exactly, because so much of this is dependent on individuals who live in one very specific part of the world that, if you've been to Silicon Valley, it's a really unique place, but it's very kind of quirky and specific culture of entrepreneurialism and sort of technology can solve everything.
Yeah.
I sometimes worry. I saw somebody tweet the other day saying, there'll always be new jobs. For example, when technology came along and took over sort of industrial weaving, this is why weaving doesn't exist anymore. This blanket statement. It's like many parts of the world where people do weave, and it's kind of an artisan craft still. And also, what does it mean if the things that we do today don't exist anymore? There's just this kind of assumption that technology is always the best answer and the best option, which comes from the people who build it. So I think we really need other types of people to participate in this conversation, whether that's writers, creatives, artisans and policymakers and all of these different voices, ethicists who bring other dimensions to the conversation and not just technology is always good.
Well, it's been great to start the conversation here, and your book is a fantastic conversation starter as well. And I wish you luck with the book, Madhu. It's been brilliant to speak to you today.
Thank you so much.